if Ukraine is part of NATO, and if they decide to return Crimea using military means, European countries will automatically be at war with Russia. The military capacities of NATO and Russia are incomparable. Even though Russia is a military superpower, a nuclear superpower, there will be no winners, and you will be drawn into this conflict against your own will. It'll happen before you can say knife. And neither Mr. Macron nor myself want such a development.
Straightforward words a few days ago from Russian President Putin during a meeting with French President Macron, who had initiated this meeting to talk with Putin about how war is avoidable. In Catholic doctrine, there are just wars, but they are allowed only under certain conditions. War, it says, must be waged for a just cause. Well, unfortunately, all those involved in a war always claim that they are waging war for just reasons. St. John Paul II put it accurately: war is a defeat for humanity. Just or unjust, justified or unjustified. We want to explore that today, together with our regular guest Gilles Emmanuel Jacquet, assistant professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations, and he also works at the International Peace Research Institute in Geneva. Gilles is considered an expert and has been interviewed on the topic of the Ukraine conflict by Fox News and other networks. There will be no winners. On EWTN TV UN BLOG. Greetings. About the current Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Ukrainian and Polish bishops wrote in a joint statement, excerpt, "The current situation poses a great threat to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and to the entire European continent, which can destroy the heritage of many generations that have built a peaceful order and unity in Europe. War can never be a suitable means of solving international problems," the bishops warn. On the contrary, it creates new, more serious conflicts, as the past has shown. Seeking and promoting peace is the mission of every Christian. A fellow Catholic, a good friend, who is regular guest here, and an expert on Russia. I welcome Gilles Emmanuel Jacquet. Hello, Gilles.
Good afternoon, Chris.
Do you think the United Nations, for example, can do anything helpful in the current Ukraine conflict?
Well, it will be very difficult for the United Nations to intervene because the only body at the UN Nations that is able to take decisive action on the situation in Ukraine, it's the Security Council. And at the Security Council, you have Russia. So if the US or UK or France make any proposition that is considered as harmful by Russia, Russia will veto it. And on the other side, if Russia is taking a decision that is not in the interest of its Western partners, well, its Western partners will veto it. So it's locked, it's a dead end. If we have a look at which international or regional organizations are involved, it's mainly the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And besides that, you had the Minsk Protocol and the so-called Normandy format that are supposed to deal with the conflict, but recently they have been, unfortunately, highly ineffective.
First of all, there is a format in which mediation takes place in the context that we are talking about. That format is based on the Minsk Agreement and the so-called Normandy 4. And it was always very clear from the members of the Normandy Four, Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine, that this was not a negotiation within a UN framework. So the UN is not, there is no resolution supporting that, and there has never been an acceptance by the parties to have the UN as a formal mediator in this situation. One thing I can guarantee is that my good offices are permanently available and are permanently available to ease the reduction of tensions.
All right, very briefly to explain. The Minsk Protocol of 2014 is a paper implementing a peace plan by Ukrainian President Poroshenko and the Russian President. The main goal was a limited ceasefire. However, it was broken. But in 2015, on the initiative of Germany and France, a new ceasefire agreement was reached. The Normandy format, which was mentioned by Gilles, is a semi-official peace plan for the Ukraine between governments and foreign ministers, between Russia, France and Germany from 2014. And as Gilles mentioned, so far both of these plans were fruitless in their applicability in the context of the current Ukraine crisis. Gilles, back to the United Nations for a moment. Its track record on conflict resolve does not look very rosy. I remind of Syria. Nothing has come of it since 2019.
Yeah, right. If we have a look at what happened in Syria as well, the UN seemed powerless. And once again, it's the same problem. It's about the Security Council. In Syria, in Ukraine, and many other conflicts we have nowadays, the problem is that indirectly we have UN Security Council members that are involved in these conflicts. So it's very hard for them to take decisions in favor of peace or to take decisions that would be detrimental to their strategic or political interest. So that's the reason behind why the UN seems to be lagging in conflict resolution nowadays.
A very alarming sign that recently the US president asked US citizens in Ukraine to leave the country. And most Europeans think it is very likely that there will be a serious conflict.
Well, yes, we've heard that US citizens were asked to leave Kiev and Ukraine. Some US diplomats and other Western diplomats as well left the Ukrainian capital. And we've heard recently as well that many Ukrainian oligarchs fled the country. Many people would say that it's not a good sign. However, if we have a look as well at the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian President Zelensky said that the US and Western countries shouldn't give such message, shouldn't show such signs because it's escalating the tensions and worsening the situation. So it may be a bad sign, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Russia will invade. Moreover, if we have a look at the interest behind such kind of invasion for Russia, we don't see many logical reasons as it would trigger a harsh reaction against Russia and additional sanctions. But yes, you're right, seeing people leaving the country is not a good sign.
Well, it seems the Ukraine conflict has drastically opened the eyes of us Europeans that we should not take our own security for granted. What do you think?
Exactly. Well, the Ukrainian conflict, it's in fact a way for Europeans to see that they haven't been able to create a sort of European security organization architecture as they were talking about just at the end of the Cold War. There have been many occasions, but I would say there have been many missed opportunities. In '91, there was this agreement that NATO wouldn't expand eastwards, and there were discussions about integrating Russia further, not in NATO, but in the Russia-NATO Council. During the Ukrainian crisis in 2014, the European Union tried to intervene, but most of its action has been in a way sabotaged by the action of the US government at that time. So clearly what we see in this Ukrainian crisis, it's the strategic weakness of European Union.
Speaking of war, it seems to me, and this is my own personal opinion, seems to me that America does mostly fight wars that are many thousands of miles away from the United States. But shouldn't the Europeans, especially Germany, rather try to be friendly with Russia? The country is basically around the corner. And for Germany, for the EU, so much depends on being connected with Russia. Why do the heads of state believe that it is necessary to get involved in this conflict?
Well, it's true that if you are in the US or if you're the US government and if you're in Europe or if you're a member of a European government, you will not necessarily have the same perspective on the conflict. It's true that the United States of America are thousands of miles away, so they are not affected by these conflicts as we are. They are not affected as well by the migrations caused by this conflict as we are. So clearly there is not the same perspective. We Europeans, we are neighbors of Ukraine and Russia as well. And we know what are the effects of conflicts on our continent. We experienced it several times. So clearly we don't have the same perspective. And from the German point of view as well, we have as well to keep in mind that in Germany, but in many other European countries, there is a high energy dependence towards Russian natural gas as well. That's why some countries try to be more nuanced or more cautious. But I would say that's maybe as well more generally a different approach we have in Europe. France, for example, opposed the invasion of Iraq in the past. So clearly we don't have the same perspectives.
As you explained it, there is a lack of mutually coordinated approach. It seems like everyone is cooking their own soup and pursuing their own agendas.
Yes, and one thing with regard to the European Union as well, we don't have a single strategic approach. We talked a lot about making a partnership with Russia, but it didn't work well over the last years, especially with regard to the 2014 crisis in Ukraine. The problem as well is that in the European Union, you have countries that are quite critical towards US strategic plans in Europe or in the world. Europe is divided, and especially as we do not have a strategic vision, well, it's very easy for the US to impose its strategic vision among its allies in Europe. So clearly that's one of the reasons as well why we don't have a single voice, why we can't be heard, why we don't have in a way a coherent approach to the conflict in Ukraine or moreover all the conflict in Eurasia.
Isn't it also kind of being pushed into a conflict because one just don't have a meaningful and coordinated strategy?
I think it's rather a game of pressure that is exercised on Russia for now many years. It's not new, it's like in a way a bluff as well. When some countries talk about war, talk about a harsh reaction. I would say it's mainly a bluff. People talk a lot, but I'm sure they don't hope to be engaged in a military conflict.
Now, is this the beginning of a new Cold War era between Russia and Europe?
Unfortunately, yes. It's a new Cold War. Even Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was one of the highest officials in the US, who was involved in the Cold War during the 2014 crisis, he said that we were not making the right choices with regard with Russia and we were maybe antagonizing Russia too much. There should be another approach. Once again, I would say it's a history of missed opportunities since 1991, since the collapse of Soviet Union. There were attempts to build a sort of let's say, strategic architecture or as well peace settlement mechanisms for our continent in partnership with Russia. But things started to change with the war in Iraq, then the recognition of the independence of Kosovo by the USA and the conflict in South Ossetia and the Arab Spring. And after these events, clearly the gap between Russia and its Western partners was wider. So it will be very difficult now to bridge this gap, but it's necessary for peace in Eurasia.
Giles, I thank you for all this important information, and please keep us informed.
Thank you, Chris. See you.
Desidero ringraziare tutte le persone e le comunità che il 26 gennaio scorso si sono unite nella preghiera per la pace in Ucraina. Continuiamo a supplicare il Dio della pace perché le tensioni e le minacce di guerra siano superate attraverso un dialogo serio e affinché a questo scopo possano contribuire anche i colloqui nel formato Normandia. E non dimentichiamo, la guerra è una pazzia.